If you go to like the top 10 players in the industry and you ask them, hey, when you say patient centricity, are you doing a focus group or are you actually sitting down and listening to them?
The learning's never percolated throughout the rest of the organization.
Yeah.
Right. And so essentially you're kind of blind leading the blind across many studies, across many CROs, and no one's really learning how to do it.
The other piece of this is you can redo a lot of things in a physical way, whether that's physical examinations, whether that's drug administration. There's a lot of fantastic digital technology that exists out there today that we're just not leveraging enough of because folks are afraid.
This is Trial and Error, where we dive deep into the world of clinical trials, uncovering the challenges, breakthroughs, and stories behind the scenes. Clinical trials are the backbone of advancing medical care, yet the administrative hurdles of getting sites started up and getting patients through the door often slows down progress.
Today's guest is Azeem Khan, a senior manager in clinical operations transformation solutions lead at BeiGene. Azeem leads efforts to modernize clinical trials using DCT models and design thinking. His work prioritizes reducing patient burden and enhancing trial efficiency by focusing on the real needs of patients, site staff, and internal teams. Azeem's career in clinical research began at UCSF Medical Center, where he managed over 275 trials and reduced study startup times significantly. He then moved to Gilead Sciences, where he contributed to the successful NDA filing for a first-in-class HIV treatment and gained valuable experience in risk-based monitoring and decentralized capabilities. His leadership in decentralized trials and digital technologies expanded during his time at a startup, where he implemented strategies to streamline digital health research. Now at BeiGene, Azeem's commitment to applying human-centric design translates to practical, effective solutions in clinical operations. His approach ensures that the technological advancements and operational strategies are aligned with the lived experience of those that they serve, making clinical research more efficient, accessible, and truly patient-focused.
The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent. Azeem, it's super awesome to have you today on Trial and Error. Very excited to talk to you. You have like a pretty interesting background, I'd say. It's not too often that you get to meet people whose whole job, or at least their whole career up to date, has been really focused on breaking down silos. So much of the conversation in the industry is about how hard it is to communicate. It's super awesome to have you. Maybe you could get a little bit of an intro. And what I'd love to hear is just a little bit about what you're doing right now and kind of your background on user-centered design and design thinking.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Alice. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and hopefully learn a little bit more. A little bit about myself. How did I get into this wonderful industry completely by chance, as I'm sure a lot of other people you've talked to and other guests you've had on the show could attest to. I think my kind of intrigue for clinical research or R&D really got sparked by a trip I took when I was in the 8th grade to Genentech's headquarters. That was a very interesting experience. I think that was just like a little subconscious thought that stuck in my mind all these years. When I was in my undergrad, I took a biotechnology course, actually. And the premise of that course was at the end of it, you'd have the opportunity to pitch a biotech company idea to a group of your peers. And the top 3 ideas would have the opportunity to go in front of a panel of actual VCs and investors.
Wow.
So unfortunately, I wasn't in the top 3. We came in 4th, close enough. But that was a really interesting learning experience, learning about the different regulations, learning about different company structures, learning about how R&D really is conducted and trying to come up with a business model for it is really intriguing. Straight out of undergrad, though, that was very interesting times. I went to UCSF. I worked there for quite a bit in the Office of Clinical Research, learned a whole lot there, met a lot of very interesting people, a lot of interesting PIs, and then I happened to get an opportunity at Gilead. So I went there, worked in our HIV TA for some time, also learned quite a bit there, especially about RBQM. AI and machine learning craze was just starting up at that time, where it was really ramping up in the industry. So got exposed to that work with people who worked, had projects in that area quite a lot. Got my first taste of writing out some playbook material for DCTs there as well. Ran a bunch of studies, the typical stuff that you get used to. And then I went to a startup after that, digital therapeutics startup, 2020, height of the pandemic, all sorts of craziness going on.
Height of digital health as well, yeah.
Oh, it was great. I loved it. You learned a lot, especially, startups, you just wear so many different hats, right? So you get exposed to many different disciplines. You get to do all sorts of cool, fun, wacky, and sometimes not so interesting stuff. But I really appreciated that experience. And then took a short break, and then I hopped over to where I am today. You asked about my design thinking, user-centric design experience background. I've been doing that for 8, 9, 10, somewhere around there, years now. Started off in a kind of a
well, maybe for the audience, let's first talk about like what is design thinking and why is
Sure.
it important. And one interesting thing about your backstory, which I didn't appreciate before, was how interesting and I guess how holistic your introduction to biotech was, because I don't think most people, when they think about biopharma, they think about the kind of holistic coordination of all of these different experts in order to bring these companies to life.
Yeah.
If I had to guess, most people are really thinking about the science, the preclinical area, so that clinical development is just that thing that happens, but like somehow magically clinical development happens, and then
Yeah.
you get your drugs on market. Anyway, yeah, what is design thinking?
Sure. So in a nutshell, design thinking is a user-centric approach to problem solving. So really the idea at its core of any human-centric design process is really you have to empathize with your users. You have to understand their pain points, their issues. You have to understand how does their life work? How do they operate? What time is someone getting up to do work? And, in between the steps from when they leave bed to when they first touch their computer, what are the different things that they're doing? Because consciously or unconsciously, a lot of those behaviors have implications for how someone goes about the rest of their day. Someone is getting coffee every single morning. It's a routine at 8:05. That coffee machine's timer goes off and a fresh pot of coffee comes out. If there's a disruption to that flow, the rest of their day is thrown into whack. Now, looking at a person's life, a day in the life or, days, multiple days in their life and trying to understand what are they interacting with, who are they talking to, what are they experiencing, what are they feeling as they go about different tasks and different activities that they're doing. Once you understand that and you've empathized with your user, then it's about, well, now that we've pulled all this data together, where are the highs and lows in your journey, in that user persona's journey? You try and identify that, and then from there you look at, all right, what can we try and solve for? Mm-hmm. And again, any user-centric process is not complete without bringing your user back in, right? You can't just go to them and take all this data and then leave them out in the lurch. It's really important to bring them or a representative like them back into the conversation and be like, hey, we've identified this as a challenge that you're facing. How do you want to fix it? How do you want to solve it? Let's have an ideation session, which is my favorite thing in the world. You've got these massive whiteboards, these massive, notepads, and we've got sticky notes of all different colors. You've got Sharpies, and we're going through, rounds and multiple rounds of ideation. We're prioritizing ideas. We're voting for ideas that folks like. And then you go and prototype. Right? I think one thing is a bit of a tangent, but one thing most people do is, you go to a company, they come up with an idea, we start doing a product, and then you roll it out. In our industry, in biotech and pharma especially, this concept of prototyping small pieces at a time doesn't exist. It's you go big or you go home, right?
Yeah,
Throw
true.
it all in there at once and hope it works. If it doesn't, you're back to the drawing board, which is the opposite of user-centric design. You start off small, you go chunk by chunk, test the different things, you iterate, and you keep on iterating. And again, at the end of the day, what you really want is you want to leave your user very satisfied, very happy, and absolutely delighted with whatever solution you've come up with. Because if you don't do that, there's very little point in making a product.
User-centered design and design thinking seems obviously good when you say it like that. Why is it so important to bring that kind of thinking into biopharma?
I think it goes back to this idea of, go big or go home. In our industry, if you take the example of specifically of clinical studies, right? It's very difficult, and I would say not at all very smart, to be like, hey, we want to run a proof of concept study with, just this tiny little piece of information and, just only this small molecule, and we're going to run a proof of concept study and that's it, right? Sometimes it works, but, you have to have a certain amount of confidence and certain amount of data in the safety of the drug to be able to be like, yes, let's run the proof of concept. We're going to run an early phase first in human study. Then we're going to do our phase 2, phase 3, etc. So when it comes to running our trials from a drug development perspective, I don't think that that's somewhere where you can insert it. Where can you insert it then, you're probably thinking? Well, when you're running a trial, there's processes involved, there's technology involved, there's people involved. right? Those are the areas and those are the opportunities where you're able to insert that type of user-centric design. So, a process that's, for example, let's take SDV. This has been the gold standard in the industry for God knows how long, right? But it's something that we know today just doesn't work with the technology and tools that we have. You can't have your CRA going to every single on-site visit performing 100% SDV, because that doesn't leave them time to look at other type of data or information. That doesn't really...
Oh, yeah.
As I pretty well know,
Yeah.
right? 100% SDV just doesn't do the trick. So how do you solve it? RBQM and RBM are one way to do it, but that CRA, when they're going to that on-site visit, there are processes that they're following. There are tools that they're using. There are people that they're talking to, right? The question you've got to ask yourself, or I have to ask myself, is that process working for you? Is that tool working for you? Or are the people you work with or the people you have to talk to, is there any sort of barrier that exists there? To do that, I really need to understand where you're coming from. I really need to put myself in your shoes, and not at all in a, blase, like, oh yeah, let's put ourselves in the shoe and imagine a day that like I'm on boots on the ground, I'm shadowing you, I'm observing you, or I'm holding an interview with you, and I'm trying to really dig through, almost like I'm digging through your psyche to figure out, what is going on? What do you do? All right. Because I want to be intimately familiar with the story that you have to tell, because every user has a different story. At the end of the day, many of the components of that story line up and there are bits and pieces you can pull out. But, that's really what this is all about. To your question about user-centric design thinking, why is it so important to bring into this industry? I think without it, we're just going to keep churning the same way we've been churning for the last 60 plus years.
Oh man, that is so true. It's very difficult to kind of engender change, especially in this industry. I can't imagine though that this process has been easy for you. If there's anything that people like to joke about, it's silos and risk aversion. So can you talk a little bit about how you've experienced that in the past and maybe techniques for bringing this kind of thinking into the org?
Absolutely, yes. Silos very much exist and very much are a real thing, irrespective of which company you're at. Let me take a step back. So when I tell someone, hey, I want to do this thing, I want to run this design thinking approach or human-centric design approach, they look at me like I'm an alien with a gazillion eyes. They're like, one, what the heck is that? And two, why should we do this thing? What's in it for me, right? Because at the end of the day, you're really asking these people to make a leap of trust. To break down some of those barriers, I like to get the different people who are involved to participate in a, mini design thinking activity. Plenty of different examples out there. I'm sure if you go in and you type in IDEO design thinking exercise or Stanford D School, wallet exercise, you'll get a couple of different examples, and there's different ways to do it. But the point of it really is get them a little bit exposed to what the feeling is like, because there's the current way of doing things, the modus operandi, which is you have an idea and you run with it. And then at the end of it or near the end of it, you're like, oh, nobody wanted this and nobody cares about it, or it doesn't deliver any value. We're back to the drawing board. Or you start off from the very beginning, you understand how you're delivering value. How are you solving the problem and why are you solving the problem before you put all that money, time, and resources into fixing or addressing a solution, right? So breaking down the silos is cross-functional perspective is you just got to put on your best smile and take the punches as they come. I think that's the easiest way to put it is it takes a while, designing, getting folks to understand it from a cultural perspective takes quite a bit of time, especially in large companies, for folks who are not exposed to it, it takes time. And you just have to be patient and you have to communicate very well, whether you're communicating in formal settings like a meeting or whether they're informal, catch-ups or one-on-ones, but having a dialogue and having a conversation with different stakeholders across different functional areas is very important. The other thing is, you might have 5 functional areas that you're like, yes, these are the core areas that are involved and, we got to break down the silos that exist around them. But my thing is look at the other areas beyond just, that small core, that small group. Because you really need people to understand what the story is. And sometimes just going one way, having a unidirectional or bidirectional chat with someone isn't going to move the needle. Mm-hmm. You need to talk with other people who are outside of that direct functional area who work with these different people to be able to be like, hey, I had this very interesting chat about, designing or human-centric design the other day. And it's like, oh yeah, by the way, I've been working on that. And then you get a little bit of encouragement out there, but you also get the curiosity spark outside of the org. And then that's how you kind of get this, what is it called? It's, like when you light a match and the flame races down the tip of the match. That's really what it is. What is a spark of ingenuity or creativity or inspiration? Because once you have that, it's a lot easier to kind of try, start breaking down some of these silos. If you can't break down the wall, you can at least punch a bunch of holes in it so there's a grid between which you can talk, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I was at the Innovative Network Gathering conference a couple months ago, and there was a talk done by an individual from Roche, and they were talking about the importance of having a translator. I think they had talked about it in the context of having they referred to it as the red shirt, the person with the red shirt. I think it was a Star Trek reference, but don't hold me to that. And the idea here was that it's so important to get all the cross-functional stakeholders, both the core and the ancillary, or people who may be a little bit further away from the problem. But it's not enough. You also need the individual who can kind of bridge the perspectives, talk the language, and so on. It sounds a bit like that's maybe your current role and that's what you do, but can you talk a little bit about that, the translator role, and maybe how do you break down those walls? It's not just about kind of having the meetings, right? It's also about understanding the perspectives.
Absolutely. So I'm very lucky to be where I am today and to have the varied exposure that I've got. So, I know quite a bit about coding and programming, even though that's not my primary education or my experience background. This is just something I'm passionate about on the side. I love little data science projects and working in Python and doing fun, wacky things in Jupyter with data science and all that. But then it's also this, other human element aspect, because everyone has a very different language, and I don't mean the literal spoken language. I mean the language of the things that they value, the things that they have an ambition for, the things that they desire, their goals, right? And if you can't speak that same language to a different person, person to person, it's very hard to get anywhere. So, if I'm talking to someone in data science, I'm not going to be talking like FinOps language. I'm going to be talking about data management, data science language. If I'm talking to someone in legal and privacy, I'm not going to be talking the data science language. I'm going to be talking the legal and privacy language. Right? So it's important that you have to understand the world that the other person is living in. You have to understand what they value most. You have to understand what they desire, really, at the end of the day. Because, just because you work with someone cross-functionally, and this is very true, especially for study teams, who are operating our clinical studies, we have cross-functional teams. But if you have someone in, biostats who doesn't understand how lab samples are managed or how lab samples are requisitioned and all that, they will have a completely different perspective of what goes wrong or what happens when they're reviewing PD and IBD listings. Right? They're like, oh, this is all your fault, or, the steering never did this, or the study manager never did this, or, the PI never did this. But when you speak their language and you try and explain to them that, hey, look, from a biostat perspective, the reason why it's a PD or an IPD or why this thing happened is because of XYZ, but you break it down in their understanding and in their kind of dialect almost. That's where you're able to break down a lot more of those barriers. So I think what you were saying about this person who's speaking, that is indeed what it is. You really need to have this translation almost. I don't know if you've watched, what is it? Key and Peele, like they have Obama's anger.
That's it. No, that's a great throwback. Yeah, that's a good one.
So you kind of need that, whether that's you or that's someone on your team or someone you work with. It differs from person to person based on your capabilities, your time, and all that. But for me, I find a lot of delight in knowing a lot of these things and doing a lot of it myself, right?
Right.
Especially coming from a startup background where you have to know the different functions and how everyone operates. How does data engineering work, and how are they different from software engineering teams? And how is software engineering team different from a product team? How are they different from a clinical team? Right? Being able to navigate that world adeptly and maintaining the balance of weaving all those different voices together is very important.
Yeah, that's such an interesting take, because so much of the industry, even from people who are coming in like at the undergrad and graduate level, it's all about, and this is true of science and academia generally, is so much about hyper specialization, being extremely good or extremely knowledgeable about a specific thing. And I think the case that's being made here is that there's almost this meta specialist, which is the supreme generalist, right? The person who actually knows just enough about every little thing to arguably be dangerous, but also just to facilitate the conversations that need to be had. And that's kind of the argument being made, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, you can have specialists who are fantastic at their jobs, but more often than not, specialists aren't making critical decisions. They're individual contributors, or they're people part of a broader team, but they're not the ones who are looking at it from a bird's eye view and making a decision. That tends to go to people who have a bit more of this, the T spectrum of, right? And that's where I think is very interesting is people have forgotten over time because the narrative over the last 10, 15 years, if you go to any self-help book, especially from computer science background, right? They'll be like, oh, you really got to understand this one particular area, but you have to understand the different libraries that are involved in different packages, and you have to be able to build a different code and all that. It's like, that's great and all, but that doesn't apply to everybody else in the rest of the world, right? And I think that people are forgetting quite a bit that before we had all this technology, humans were not specialists. We were generalists in a lot of different ways. Yes, you had hunter-gatherers and you had different tribes and all that. And tribes, you had roles within the tribe, but people didn't operate in a silo, right? Because if you operate in a silo, you'd die. That was the whole point. You had to be a generalist. You had to be able to reach, across and, talk to someone in a completely different world and be like, hey, I want to do this thing, or hey, I'm thinking about this thing. What do you suggest we do? But I think it's just, as a human race, we've just grown so exponentially, and the way work has evolved has kind of shut that out. Because they're like, oh, we'll just throw a specialist body at it, and that'll solve the problem. It's like, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It's a matter of measuring where and when. Does that make sense for you?
That is such an interesting comparison. I don't think I've ever heard of someone talk about work as it relates to hunter-gatherers and how specialization is perhaps not always the greatest. So I'll definitely keep that in the back pocket. We had talked about RBQM, and we had talked about how there are better ways of monitoring and data cleaning and just making sure that you have high integrity data and patients are safe. And a lot of that does stem from kind of taking a out of the box design thinking approach. Do you have a particularly proud moment that you can look back on and say, it was this kind of thinking that led to this kind of outcome that you'd be open to sharing?
In what context, I should ask?
Whatever you want. I think within the context of trial and processes, if I had to point in a direction, it sounds like you've done a lot. We often talk about patient centricity, and patient centricity and design thinking are somewhat one and the same topic. If I had to make that argument, is there anything around that you're like, yes, we did a great job, and here's how we approached it?
Yes, actually. So when I was at my last company, when I came in, so my boss was a fantastic guy, absolutely fantastic. We had an idea of the study, or he had an idea of the studies that we needed to run, but we didn't have any infrastructure really set up to run any of these things, right? And so I think that's where it was a really good opportunity because, one, I think having heard many different speakers and conferences prior to joining that company, I'd become a little bit disgruntled with the lack of actual patient centricity. It was just a buzzword. And to a certain extent, and I know some people are going to crucify me for this, it's still to an extent, it's a buzzword today, unfortunately.
Right.
There are very, very, very few companies that know what patient centricity means, and they execute well on that. But anyways, I remember we had this idea of a study, had very little infrastructure, and we were trying to figure out how do we set up the different things. So we're like, let's assume we know nothing at all about how typical clinical studies are run or clinical programs are run. If we only looked at the patient experience and the idea of decentralization, which is getting away from brick and mortar sites to make it convenient for our patients, how would you design the study? If you had to make a chart, if you had to have different pieces on it, how would you create that study? And I remember that was probably the most interesting experience, and it was a really, really good exercise for us because we created a diagram, we had a process, we had a flow chart really of what does the patient feel as they're going through this process, right? we're asking these questions of ourselves of, once they go through the pre-screening or once they've signed the consent and we're asking them to complete their screening procedures, what does that experience to them look like? What does it feel like? And we drew some of that based on our own hypotheses, but then some of it, we just went out. We went out and chatted with the PI. We went and chatted out with our clinical teams who had talked to this user group. And we're like, hey, based on what you guys are doing, this works well, this won't work, or, we should refine this. So we try to incorporate a lot of their voice into that particular study, got that study launched, learned a whole bunch, and oh my God, the different things I could tell you about from that experience. But then the second study that we ran, that was a very unique study. It was a women-only study in a very specific indication that not a whole lot of treatment exists out there. It wasn't a rare disease per se, but, it was a very, very, the women who went through that particular disease were very marginalized, as unfortunately is the case in a lot of clinical research, right? But I remember we talked with some of these patients and we said, hey, here's an idea for a study that we're thinking about. These are the different things we might ask you to do, and these are the different ways you go about doing them. What do you think? It was like, oh my God, that's, why did someone do this earlier? And I know there's going to be people who listen to this podcast and they're like, oh, well, we do a lot of that. We already incorporate these patient advisory boards and these patient advocacy groups, and we bring them in. It's like, that's too late. You can't bring them in once you have a protocol synopsis. You have to bring them in even before that point. And it's not just about what kind of assessments and procedures and frequencies you're selecting. It's about the actual things themselves, right? That's what people often miss, in my personal opinion at least, is it's really easy to say, oh, well, I'm going to take out these 4 pros because we don't want them to have 8 pros to complete. Right. That's a lot of burden. That's a really flimsy excuse and flimsy attempt at feeding. Honestly.
I hear you.
Quantitative attempt to be like, hey, let me make this more patient-centric by reducing the work amount that you have to do.
Right.
That's not patient centricity. Patient centricity is showing them the questionnaire and asking them, how are you feeling as you go about completing the survey? Is this making you more anxious? Is this making you less anxious? Is this frustrating? Is this exciting? What is going through your mind as you're going through and completing this? That's what real patient centricity. It's not just looking at the number of assessments you have and like, hey, I'm going to chop these out. That's not patient centric. It's about going to a physical location and sitting down with the PI or the study coordinator or the study nurse and be like, hey, we're planning on having this kind of physical assessment done. Or, it's going to, if it's a IV study drug, for example, this is the type of procedure that's going to happen. Or if you have a tablet, this is the size of the tablet. This is the size of the pill. This is the size of the capsule. What do you think? What does your patient think about this? Have they experienced this before? And you bring in the patients as well. Be like, hey, this is what we're thinking about. What do you, what are your thoughts? Let's have an open discussion. Let's have an open, honest dialogue about it. Because in a patient advisory board or in a patient focus group, you're only asking about study design. That's it. You're asking about the number of assessments and how much time it takes to complete the assessment, but you're not asking, hey, how many hours do you have to take off from work? Hey, is someone going to take care of your kids if you have kids? Who's going to be, if you're a cancer patient, for example? I heard this a couple months ago when we invited a speaker to speak to us about hematology, oncology trials. And he was like, people in the oncology space, pharma tends to forget that if you have a patient who's in your trial, this is almost like their last option for them. So you have someone like this patient who flies all the way from Georgia to Texas for 3 to 4 days at a time. And he's like, I don't care about how much the flight costs or where I'm going to stay. Like, my PI has already, they're assisting me with that. I'm worried about who's going to cut my grass when I'm gone from home. Who's going to walk my dog while I'm at home? Who's going to pay the electricity bill? Did I fill up the gas? Did I lock the doors? Did I close the windows? Did I do all that stuff? That's what patient centricity is about. Is you really need to understand the life of that participant rather than making a judgment about the number of things they're going to see on a piece of paper.
Yeah, there's so many sites out there who are probably listening to this going, yes, preach, Azeem. We've been trying to tell sponsors this for years. That study that you did, for the people who are, I guess, non-believers, are there specific tangibles or areas that you could say, because we actually started with the patient in mind before even designing the protocol, these were some of the outcomes that we were able to have?
Absolutely. So the first study we did, we finished our enrollment in about, I think it's 3 months or 4 months. I don't remember exactly. The second study we did, we finished enrollment in 5 weeks.
Wow.
And the second study, I think we enrolled like over 100 participants, and the first study was 130 participants.
Okay, and the second one was the one where you had actually gone out, talked to sites, talked to patients before you had even designed the study, just to understand what those. Wow, that is incredible.
We just have an idea. This is what it could look like. This is what the treatment may or may not look like. Of course, we didn't show them the treatment, but really, this is in theory, in concept, this is what it is. But this is what being on the trial means. You're going to be doing this thing on this day, and you're going to be doing this on this day, and you're going to have to talk to this person on blah, 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 blah. And we got very good, candid feedback. Even stuff that we honestly, I'm sure that our head of clinical was like, I didn't want to hear that. I didn't want to know that. We heard it. And that's the important thing. It's like you need to have those, you need to hear that stuff that you think you already know, or you think you have a solution to be able to be like, hold on, I'm just so tunnel vision right now. I have to take a step back. And you get that honesty from your patients, because the patients are the ones who are going through this experience and this problem and this challenge, right? It's not the PIs or study coordinators. The PIs and study coordinators are facilitating their participation. They know these people very well. But they're not the ones who are taking the drug. They're not the ones who are taking the pros. That's a completely different person. The role of the study coordinator and PI is a completely different one. And that has its own set of challenges and its own set of problems that, we could have a whole other discussion about, and I would love to. But that's what patient-centric is, right?
Right. It's almost an orthogonal way of thinking to classic operations, because basically what you're saying is that so much of it is identifying the things that you don't know. Right? Whereas most people want to control known variables. Yeah. And so, and that's scary territory to ask people who are doing this.
It 100% is. And that's, a lot of pharma companies are very uncomfortable with this idea for that exact reason. If you go to like the top 10 players in the industry and you ask them, hey, when you say patient centricity, are you doing a focus group, or are you actually sitting down and listening to them? I can guarantee you the top, of the top 10, maybe only one or two are actually sitting down with the patient and having this discussion. The rest of them are just, caregivers group or patient advisory board or whatever it is, and they're getting that. But there's a difference between the tangible and the intangible. If you give someone a butterfly needle and you show them the IMP bottle, or if you show them the blood draw tube and you say, hey, this is the amount of blood we're going to take out from you. This is the size of the needle. This is the gauge of the needle. And we're going to do this every so often. What do you think about? You're going to get a very different experience than if you just sit in a room with a bunch of people and like, hey, we're going to have this number of blood draws on our study every number of weeks. What do you guys think about this? It's a completely different narrative when you change the story. And that's really where the gap for patient centricity lies. Is right now, everything is conceptual and very soft, and we are patient centric, but we're not really patient centric. But we're not going to tell you that. Right? And it's unfortunately how many companies operate. And that's where I'm like, no, this is not what user-centric design is all about. User-centric design is, it's almost like you have to become a shadow of the person you're trying to understand. Because if you don't do that, what's the point? Right? The person is just going to tell you what they think they need or what problem they think they have. That's very different than you following and observing and talking and finding out for yourself in addition to what they're saying, right? Because there's this beautiful little phrase, what is it? If you take like the London 2, the speaker is always like, mind the gap, right? And there is a gap between what someone is telling me versus what I'm observing with my own eyes. And that's what we're not doing today in this industry. We're not minding the gap.
That was really well put. And for all this discussion about intangibles, I once read that a blockbuster drug, which shall not be named, had they gone to market 1 month earlier, you had just mentioned that your second study was completed in 5 weeks. Had they gone out 1 month earlier, it would have been about $500 million of revenue. These intangibles, at the end of the day, are very, very tangible, especially for the folks who are so hesitant to put them in practice.
Oh, 100%. 100%. And the other piece of this is you can redo a lot of things in a physical way, whether that's physical examinations, whether that's drug administration, whether that's, biomarker sampling or whatever you call it. There's a lot of fantastic digital technology that exists out there today that we're just not leveraging enough of because folks are afraid for different reasons, right? Whether that's data privacy reasons and GDPR, whether that's around complexity of provisioning things and logistics and all that, or whether that's just around, does your biostats team know how to analyze gate data, for example, right? There's just this resistance and this hesitance to do all this. And it's like, the way I see it, all these questions, if pharma isn't going to answer them, tech companies are going to answer them. And does it make, do you want to be ahead of the curve or do you want to be behind the curve? That's the real question.
That's an interesting thought. I hadn't considered tech companies creating devices as being a competitor in that sense to pharma, but that is an interesting thought. Let's flip a bit 180 though here, right? Because we're talking about how we should take more risks and we should think more about the patients and so on. I'll also say that there was a huge hype around DCT, as we all know, and then there was maybe a I forget what the trough of disillusionment, so to speak. So how would you say that? The disillusionment with DCT, like why early adopters maybe didn't see the expected ROI and kind of what went wrong? Because I think in some ways, even though we're kind of on the linear trend of adoption now, I think a lot did go wrong. So let's talk about that.
Oh, this is wonderful. I know that there's one person I'm thinking of right now that when they hear the next couple things out of my mouth, they're just going to be shocked, kind of like gasping in horror. I think I will say very, very early on, with a lot of these DCT components or DCT elements, sponsors relied heavily on CROs to operationalize and manage the risk. And that's where a lot of things went wrong because it wasn't like CROs were experts in this either. Some of them are, absolutely. I can't ignore that fact. But the true and simple of it is we thought that this was their area of expertise, so we outsourced this to them. And that was a big mistake because if you have one CRO in one study and you have 3 different ones for your 3 other studies, the learnings that you have are never going to cascade down. They stay within the CRO. So as a sponsor company, you might have had a really terrible execution. You might have had incredible challenges like, data integrity and data collection or simply adherence from patients. These are lessons that in theory, at the end of the study, you have the lessons learned session and that's it. But if the sponsor was never involved in executing on any of that, it's just a one-time meeting, 1 hour, 1.5 hour meeting that happens and then everyone forgets about it. So I think early on, that was one thing that perhaps we didn't recognize or the industry didn't really recognize fast enough was over-reliance on CROs to do a lot of this. Because like I said, not everybody was an expert and they were just as new to it as the sponsor was. They were learning along just as much as we were. The difference is with different DCT elements, unlike in our traditional trials, the data doesn't exist on paper anymore. The data exists in a digital system or in the cloud, right? And that data has to go back to the sponsor anyways, right? At the end of the day, that's where it's going back. So why get a third party to try and understand the data, clean the data, manage the data, when the sponsors could have and should have been doing it themselves? Granted, you may have had resource limitations or time limitations or budget limitations, but that was where you could have really had the first kick in the pants and be like, oh crap, we didn't do this the right way. And the sponsor staff are the ones who are like, yes, we've learned that we need to change how we do XYZ thing, versus relying on the CRO to tell you, oh, by the way, this is something that didn't do so well and pay us more money and the next trial will do it better. I'm not even kidding. That's legitimately, I have heard this from the mouths of 2 CROs. Like,
I hear you.
Terribly. We'll do this really well next time, though. Don't worry. You just got to pay us a little bit more.
Yeah, so I guess it's basically like the blind leading the blind, but the more important factor is that the sponsor who actually has the multiple studies and the multiple programs in question, each one of these, the learnings never percolated throughout the rest of the organization.
Yeah.
Right. And so essentially you're kind of blind leading the blind across many studies, across many CROs, and no one's really learning how to do it except if you happen to be the one CRO who happens to do the same study similarly, doing a DCT model, which meant that the actual number of people who are really gaining the insight to executing these style studies was very, very nominal compared to what it should have been. And so That's kind of what
Absolutely.
you're saying, right? Yeah.
And I think the other part, or another thing that contributes to this disillusionment is the cost tag, the price tag that's associated with different DCTL.
Are you saying it's not super cheap? What? I thought that was.
It's what is transformation and innovation always comes at a price. It's never free, whether that's an upheaval of your culture, whether that's an upheaval of your funding, whether that's an upheaval of the people, an upheaval of your process, whatever it is. Nothing ever comes free. Trying to explain that to senior leadership and get them to understand is very difficult. I think there are 3 companies I can think of the top of my head that have managed to turn that ship around, the ship around DCT quite well. Lucky for that. But others are still struggling because, if you go to your EVP or SVP and you're like, hey, I need $3 million just for eCOA ePro, they're going to be like, you are insane. Number one. Number two, get out of my face and never come back to me again. That was just like, that's, And that number is an outrageous number. It is. I just realized that I think there's only one.
It's okay. I think people listening will have an idea.
It's just like, it's so trying to get someone to understand this who's not doing it on a day-to-day basis to be like, hey, we think we should, we need to do this eCOA Pro, or we need to do pros, for example. And the reason we need to do this XYZ, like, I don't care. Like, I'm just looking at the money.
Right.
And money tells me this is too much and this is not sustainable. For them, they're just going to chop it off the list. They're going to run one study and inevitably when it goes bad, as almost every single first iteration does, they're like, nope, don't want to do it anymore. I've lost my appetite for it, which is really unfortunate because, the only way we as human beings learn is not by success. We learn it through failures. And again, that's something where in this very risk-averse industry, it's a difficult pill for people to swallow.
I think one thing you might have touched on, though, is with the cost. I think there are a lot of implicit costs to adoption, which aren't always factored in. And if they're not factored in at the beginning, and you don't have that kind of human-centered design thinking hat on at the beginning, then you run a lot of risks. So just to take the example that you pick, ePro, right? Or any elements like that. Well, how regular or frequent is that data review? How are you checking if the data is high quality? It completely flies in the face of, every X period of time, we're going to do a snapshot and we're going to look at it, especially either the volume is way too high, so everything actually has to be programmed. But did you factor in the programming at the beginning of the study? Is it consistent with the rest of your data model? If you have a specific data model you're using for RBQM or central monitoring, like there's a lot of all of these other stakeholder perspectives and factors for just that adoption of one tiny element. Yeah. Now suddenly you have to think about all of these other things and who's actually doing that thinking before making that pitch to the, SVP or whatever that this is so critical and important, right?
Exactly, right? And that's another point of failure, right? ClinOps teams, we love wild ideas. So ClinOps will be like, hey, I want to do televisits, or I want to do mobile nursing units, or I want to do XYZ thing. And they're looking at it from just the operations perspective most of the time. Not all the time, most of the time. But then, when it comes to questions around data integrity, whether this is EDC data or whether this is data that goes into that provider's portal and cloud and then data management has to pull it out, that's a very different conversation. And very few people, almost nobody, I would say, really, takes a moment to sit down and think about that. When you're looking at something like eConsent, for example, did anyone talk to the stats programmers and ask them how they've configured the listings? Or whether they need to reconfigure the listings, because guess what? That data is probably not going into EDC anymore. It's probably going into that solution provider's own custom-built solution. Yes, you'll get like a SAS output, or you'll get a Excel file or a JSON file with all this data and information, but the workflow's changed now. Because rather than me just pulling a configured library from my, for example, Rave builder,
right.
Like, hey, when we're doing this study analysis, this is the data format, and this is how it's going to look, and this is how you're going to transform it, and then produce a table. That's a very different conversation than, hey, here's this e-consent data in a non-traditional format, and you guys have to create a new listing for it, right?
Yeah.
Did you talk to someone about that? Did you get their sign-up? Did you get their agreement? Do they understand what kind of implications this is going to have for their day-to-day workflows, right? Because it's no longer, you just upload it into the shared SFTP folder and that's it. It's like, no, there's a lot more work. And That's one aspect. The other aspect is, are you happy about the amount of work I'm about to introduce to your life?
Yeah, are you happy? That's a good, that's a hilarious question. I don't think I've ever heard anyone ask of any functional stakeholders. Like, yeah, we're going to do this thing, but how do you feel about that?
No, I mean, honestly, people don't. And it becomes a insidious, growing kind of source of resentment for different functional areas occasionally, right? Because they're like, I didn't want to do this. Why am I doing this? All this has so much more work and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you just never had a conversation about it. Someone just told you, hey, we're going to do this thing. And that was it. No one ever bothered to ask you, how do you feel about it? Right?
Right.
Questions aside around operational, being able to operationalize the thing in the first place, I want to know, like, is this like extremely complicated for you? Is this not at all complicated for you? Like, am I introducing dozens of more hours in your workday, or is it like, yeah, maybe 10, 15 minutes more work? And people forget that aspect and they worry more about, oh, can you do it or not? That's it. I just want to hear a yes or no. They don't want to try and understand, like, when you say yes, what does that mean? Right? And that's the human-centric part of this. The whole equation is when you ask someone about something, or when you're trying to understand, is it a surface level question, or are you trying to dig deeper? If you're digging deeper, great. If you're doing surface level exploration, everyone's going to tell you yes. And then you'll come across the naysayers of it. And that's not going to get you anywhere.
We live in a siloed world where everyone wants plug and play. But the reality is we need a transparent, human-centered world where we talk to people and understand their needs and their feelings and everything else if we want to get trials where they ought to be and actually reduce the cost of running a clinical trial. With that in mind, Azeem, is there anything you'd like to tell the audience, and where can they find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. Anything to tell the audience? If you've got an idea, or if you're interested in learning about digital health or something about wearables, sensors, anything like that, I'm happy to chat about it and, see where it goes. But yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's it.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much, Azeem. This has been wonderful, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Alice. Appreciate it. Nice chatting with you.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode of Trial and Error. Remember, every step forward in clinical research brings us closer to the next medical breakthrough. Our goal is to spread knowledge and improve the chance that life-saving drugs make it to market. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider rating us or giving us a review, as that really helps other listeners find the podcast. Most importantly, though, I'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to reach out directly and say hello.